Cool, so thanks everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about whole brain emulation, as Adam just said. And my talk will contrast a bit with Patrick's and some of the previous talks because it's quite a bit more, I suppose, upbeat, techno-progressive sort of style. My basic thesis is going to be to explain why I believe whole brain emulation is important and why it's going to be such a huge driver of technological and social change in the next few decades. And essentially that's the thesis that I'm going to put forward in this talk. So we'll see if I establish that or not. So before we get to that, and don't worry, I will define what whole brain emulation is if you don't know, but there's a bit of background that we need first. So to introduce the brain, Christoph Koch, who is a neuroscientist, has described the human brain as the most complicated or complex object in the known universe. And I definitely agree with this, because the human brain is remarkably small. These pictures here sort of give you the sense of the size. You can hold it in both hands cupped without too much difficulty, and yet all of the conscious awareness, perception, memories, personality, everything that we are as humanity is occurring inside the brain there. And the complexity of an object like this is just remarkable. So this isn't going to be a talk about neuroanatomy, but I just wanted to put up a few diagrams, just sort of get you to feel comfortable with this sort of brain as an entity, because I'm going to be talking a little bit about these kind of concepts. So, I mean, basically all we need to know here is that the brain has lots of different parts to it. This part around the edges here, called the cerebrum or the cerebral cortex, which is the very outer part, is where the really interesting stuff happens, like conscious awareness and things like that. There are lots of other parts of the brain as well, and different functions localized to particular locations. As most of you probably know, the cells that make up the most important cells in the brain are called neurons. Here's a neuron. Basically, neurons process information. That means they pick up information through the dendrites here, process it in the nucleus, and send out signals through the axon, this long bit here. Probably most of you have heard like some stuff about that before. Again, the details aren't really important. I just want to make sure that you're sort of comfortable with some of these terms. Yes, so there are also things called synapses. Basically, I just said neurons process information. They send out signals through the axon. The axon joins onto the dendrites, so these bits of other cells. So there are other cells, feeding off here. And so that's how the brain processes information. There's just heaps and heaps of neurons all connected to each other in a big complicated network. And where neurons connect to each other is called a synapse. This is a synapse. They communicate by things called neurotransmitters. These are just chemicals. You've probably heard of things like dopamine and serotonin and stuff like that. These are neurotransmitters. They're just chemicals that send signals between the neurons and allow them to communicate with each other to send those messages, to send the signals. And as I mentioned before, the brain is not composed of, just a few of these. It's composed of a very large number of neurons, and they're all connected together in big complicated networks. So this is a stylistic representation of part of the cortex, remember the outer bit where the interesting stuff happens, and they're connected in layers and in various complicated ways. Okay, so this is all setting the groundwork, just so you have some familiarity with these terms. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is coming from this wonderful paper, Whole Brain Emulation, a Roadmap, which you can get free online. So if you're interested in the type of things I'm talking about, I recommend checking it out. It goes into more detail about the sort of things I'm saying. Okay, so I said before the human brain is complicated. Here's an outline of just how complicated it is. The human brain has about 100 billion neurons in it. You'll hear somewhat different terms, but this is good enough. That's about the same number of stars as there are in the entire Milky Way galaxy. So that's a lot of neurons. And each of those neurons has something like 10,000 synapses. So remember, a synapse is one of the connections with another neuron. So each of those 100 billion neurons has thousands of connections to other neurons. So the total number of connections in the human brain, therefore, if you multiply out 10,000 by 100 billion, comes to something like 1 quadrillion, I think, which is just a ridiculously huge number. Also, it's even worse than that, because each synapse, each of those connections, has many ion channels. I didn't really describe that, but if you remember the picture of the synapse here, you can see there's lots of these channels connecting the two together, lots of neurotransmitter molecules. So it's not just like a synapse is one little thing. There's a lot of complexity there too. And remember those neurotransmitters I mentioned? There's over 100 different types of them that are known, and it's suspected there are many more that have not been discovered yet. Also, many cognitive processes are highly distributed, so it's not like there's a little bit of the brain that does language or vision or something like that. I mean, there is localization, but it's not like there's just one small bit and if you knock that out then you won't have that anymore. Most of these complicated things are highly distributed all over the cortex, and it's very hard to sort of work out exactly what's doing what. So hopefully that gives you a sense of the difficulty of the problem. Here's another way that we can present this, that we can think of the central nervous system more generally, but also the brain specifically, as being composed of many different levels of organization. So at the top we've got the whole central nervous system. At the very bottom we have individual molecules. And so from individual molecules you build up to synapses and then neurons, networks of neurons, maps, systems. So this is things like cognitive system and memory and vision and things like that. So large functions and then the system as a whole. When you're studying the nervous system, so if you're doing neuroscience, you can study at any of these levels. And usually people sort of specialize to one or two levels. So they do something with, they study the behavior of a particular neurotransmitter or a particular type of ion channel, or then maybe they study vision map formation in the occipital cortex or something like that. And in order to get to do whole brain emulation, we have to somehow put all these pieces together. We have to have a coordinated understanding. This is just another representation of those different levels. Okay, so that's sort of the bad news, that this is really quite ridiculously complicated. The good news is that it's not necessary, or at least the argument is, it's not necessary to understand the system completely in order to be able to simulate it or emulate it. So an example here, which may or may not be helpful to you, is if someone gave me a very detailed circuit diagram for a computer or a CPU or just some electronic device, and I had all the necessary components, potentially at least, theoretically, I could put that together, just copying the steps, without having any idea of how the circuit works, if I just followed the steps properly. And that's not exactly the same as what I'm arguing for the brain, but that's sort of an analogy to help understand the point. If you just get all the details right about, the synapses and the ion channels and enough of that correct, you don't necessarily have to understand how it's all fitting together properly. That's the argument about how whole brain emulation would work. You don't have to understand top-down or holistically exactly how it's all working. You just put all the pieces together, and hopefully, if you do it in enough detail, it will work. So this is essentially what the idea of emulation is. Emulation requires that you get lots and lots of details right, but it doesn't necessarily require you to understand what's going on. So this is distinct from what you might call a simulation, where you just, essentially you do the reverse. The simulation would be up here. You know what the system's doing, but you don't have to get all the details right. So an example of that might be some of the traditional artificial intelligence approaches, which try and do things like recognize speech or something like that. They do things completely differently to how the brain does it. So the details are completely irrelevant. But the functional output can sometimes be similar. Like they have some understanding of how it's done and they just do it a very different way. The idea of whole brain emulation, just to reiterate, is it's too complicated to understand how the brain is doing all this stuff. So we're not going to try to do that. Or we sort of are. But rather, we're going to try and get enough of the details right so that we can build a simulation or an emulation, and then we'll have that to work with. And I'll explain exactly what I mean by that. Now, there's a famous objection to this, which has been argued by a number of people. This is the simulated photosynthesis objection. Well, I don't actually know if it's called that, but that's what I'm calling it. The idea is here, if I built a computer simulation, programmed it all up, that simulated photosynthesis, going through all of the different proteins in the membrane and all the electrons moving around and so on, I could get a very nice model or a computer program of photosynthesis going about, but I wouldn't actually get any sugar being produced from carbon dioxide and photons because it's just in a computer. And so the analogy here is, well, clearly that won't work for photosynthesis. So, maybe the same thing applies to the mind. You could build it all in a computer, but that won't necessarily do anything. It would just be a program on a computer. It wouldn't be intelligent, or it wouldn't be conscious, or whatever exactly. Now, yes. And I'm presenting this because it's a sort of a relatively common objection, or at least it's one I've heard before a number of times. And I think it's a little bit confused. I think it sort of misses the point of what we're trying to do. Because photosynthesis isn't a cognitive process. What I mean by that is, photosynthesis is a physical process. It takes physical chemicals, basically, and energy, and converts them into different chemicals. You could simulate how that happens, but what we're really interested in is the glucose and maybe the oxygen. Like, we actually want the chemicals. The physical process is sort of interesting on a theoretical basis, but we actually want the molecules, and so putting it all in a computer won't actually give you any glucose. Now, taking the analogy to the nervous system, you could simulate a brain or a nervous system, and that won't make a muscle move, obviously. because it's just a simulation in a computer. You have to actually have some external connection to the real world to get the muscle to move, just like you have to have some external connection to get the glucose out of the simulated leap or whatever. But we're not actually interested in making a muscle move or in walking or something like that. We're just interested in getting the cognitive processes working here. So for example, if we could just work out how the brain processes audio input and sort of understands it and then produces a series of signals to produce verbal input as a response, as in when I'm talking to someone, that's purely an informational process. All I need to take in is the relevant information as sensory input and spit out the relevant information as, you know, a sequence of words that you can type on a computer, or as a series of waveforms that I can send to a speaker which produces sound. It's not an issue of needing to have any glucose. We're just interested in how does the information get processed. So all we really need is the information. So if you could talk to a computer and it could understand you, it could produce the output purely in the form of text on a screen or in terms of a speaker making a sound. So it just, to me, it doesn't seem that this wouldn't actually produce glucose objection is relevant, because photosynthesis, we want actual stuff. We want glucose or oxygen. Whereas for understanding the brain, we just want to understand the cognitive process, and that's really what we're interested in. Okay, if that was unclear, we can maybe address that in question time. So let's get on to what I think is the really interesting part. So, I said before that we're trying to simulate the brain. We're trying to build a computer model of the brain to a sufficient level of detail so that when you plug it all in and set it all up, ideally you get a mind there. You can talk to it, you know, if you've got the input set up right, and it will produce intelligent output, something like that. But for that to work, you have to have enough detail. The question is, how much detail do you need? Now, this table is probably a little bit hard to read, unfortunately. But the basic idea is it splits up. This is a way of conceptualizing how much detail is necessary for whole brain emulation to work. At the top, this is the most abstract, like it's actually what will be easier is if I show you my other slides. So this is level 1, an example of level 1. It's very abstract because you see there's no neurons here, there's no actual biological processes here. This is just very abstract processes like, well, what have they got here? Different types of memory, for example, and you have consciousness, problem-solving abilities. This is very much how sort of classical AI went about things. You have different cognitive modules which do different things. You program it in a very abstract, symbolic way, and you don't bother about the neurons or any detail about that at all. So that's a very, very high-level process because we don't really look at what's going on underneath that. Let's go down a bit further. We can talk about neural networks. So networks of neurons connected together which take in input and process it to form output. So this is recognizing shapes basically in an image. You'll notice here that we've got more detail than we had before. We've got actual things that sort of look like neurons, and they're doing some processing here, but they don't look much like neurons. These are just idealized. They're called artificial neural networks because these are just very simplified models of neurons. They're sort of, it's like we got the idea from neurons, but we didn't take many of the details. So that's level 3. Level 5, we put more of the details in. So you see it's starting to look a bit more like some of the actual neurons I showed you before. We've got actual axons and dendrites connected to each other. We look at the actual temporal process of producing an action potential, which is the transmission of electrical information from one neuron to the other. And we can go even further. We can look at the details of a protein complex. If you remember on the slides before, there were ion channels where the little neurotransmitters were moving. Well, this is what one of those actually looks like. It's a whole big complicated protein with different sections to it. Maybe we need to simulate this whole thing. We need to know the detailed structure of all of this in order for the simulation to be detailed enough to produce the behavior we're interested in. Or maybe we need to go even further than that. We need to simulate every atom individually. So this is level 10, and actually that's not the lowest level, but I don't have a visualization for the lowest level. So just to give you a feel for it. Again, the details aren't terribly important. The basic idea is the top represents very abstract, not very much detail, abstracting away from the biology. At the bottom, you're simulating everything, all the atoms, all the molecules, everything. The question is, what level of detail do we need to get the relevant behavior, for it to be, conscious, for it to understand what we're saying to it, whatever exactly we want it to do. The trouble is we don't know because we don't know how it works. If we knew how the brain worked, we could say, well, this stuff is not really necessary, but we can do that in a different way, or it's not essential, but we just need it at this level of detail or above. Sort of like the degree of resolution you need for an image. Depends on what you want to do with the image. You don't need, if you just want a little thumbnail, you don't need, 2,000 by 3,000 pixels. It's just not necessary. That information is redundant. Now, we don't know what level of resolution is needed, but most neuroscientists think it's around here. So I'm sort of going to be focusing around what's called level 5, electrophysiology. And that's this level here. That's where you're worried about all of the neurons and the synapses and how they're connected, and you're worried about their electrical behavior over time, but you're not so worried about exactly where all of the different proteins and molecules are and exactly what conformation they're in and stuff like that. That's considered to be more detail than is necessary. Okay, hopefully that is somewhat clear. Okay, so given that we've now established what we're trying to do, we're trying to emulate the brain, and we've got a sort of target level of detail that we think might be necessary. I haven't argued, by the way, why neuroscientists think that, but we can maybe do that in question time. There's 3 stages that we now need to do, and these are outlined in the paper I mentioned before, so I'm just stealing them from that. First of all, we need to scan the brain at the required resolution. So that's, the different levels. The further down you need to go, the higher the resolution you need. Second step, you need to be able to interpret that data and build a model from it. So just scanning the data, that's just a bunch of numbers in a computer. You need to build that into a model that you can implement with a program or something like that. Then the third step is that you actually have to run the simulation in a timely manner, and this is quite important. So it doesn't do you very much good if it takes you an entire month to simulate 1 second of brain activity, because that's pretty useless. Well, and that's sort of the stage we're at with a lot of this stuff. We can simulate it, but really, really slowly. So here are the 3 stages. I'm going to go through all 3 of them, although I won't say very much about number 2. But mostly I'll be focusing on number 1 and number 3. So let's talk about number 1. So again, just to reinforce what we're doing here, the question is, can we scan the brain in enough detail to be able to make a simulation? Or if we can't now, will we be able to in the near future? Like, where is the technology, basically? That's what we're asking. And there are lots of different scanning techniques that are used or could possibly be used. And I want to mention it briefly about fMRI. This is a slight tangent, but I think it's relevant because some people misunderstand this. Can people raise their hands? Who has heard of fMRI, just at all, if you don't know what it is? Who's heard of it? Slightly fewer people than I'd expected, but still most people. fMRI stands for Functional Magnetic Resonance Imaging. It's a way of imaging activity in the brain. Where's a picture of it? Oh no, I don't have a picture of it. Sorry, I'll just skip forward because I want to show you. Where's the picture? No. So it's not the best, but this is an example of the sort of pictures you see. They love to put these on like the covers of magazines and things like that because they look fancy, or some of them look fancier than this. But anyway, that's what fMRI looks like. And people often, I'm mentioning this because it gets so much media attention, and I think it's important to cover a few misconceptions about this. So basically what I want to say is fMRI is not going to give us whole brain emulation. It's really, I don't think it's very useful at all for this sort of thing. That might be slightly too strong, but certainly it's not anywhere close to sufficient. There are other technologies which I'll get to, but I just want to sort of dispense a few myths about fMRI. One thing is the resolution is just nowhere near close enough. So like 1 pixel, one of those dots that you saw on the brain that I showed you before, the smallest resolution that we can get is like 5 million neurons or something like that. I mean, it varies a bit, but that number of neurons can do a huge amount of processing. And so we're just completely obliterating all of that detail. We don't know what's going on inside that pixel. It's just all homogeneous as far as the fMRI can tell. And that's basically what this point's saying. We don't know what's going on. We can see levels of activity. I haven't explained how fMRI works because it's complicated, but all it really detects is, simply put, it detects blood flow in the brain. It's not quite accurate, but good enough for our purposes. It doesn't really tell us how the networks are connected or how the processing is occurring, and many of the results are quite specific to exactly how you do the test. So you present someone with a picture and you get this area of the brain's active, but then you do basically the same thing except maybe it's text instead, and you get a different area of the brain active, even though you would have expected the same region to be active. So the fMRI seems to be, it doesn't really tell us the sort of thing that we, it doesn't have the detail that we want in order to be able to really conduct a whole brain emulation. And small sample sizes are a problem as well. You often have studies with like 10 people, which is a bit problematic because there's a huge amount of variability too. This area of the brain activates when this person reads the passage, but a fairly different region of the brain that only slightly overlaps activates when a different person reads the passage. And what you get on these pictures is an average, but it's not really clear what that average means. So anyway, okay, so that's just my sort of sidetrack on fMRI. I just want to emphasize that that's not exactly what we're talking about here. That's functional imaging, which is not necessarily useful for whole brain emulation. There are various problems with imaging. It's really hard to get the resolution. That's probably the biggest problem. So we need to see what the individual cells are doing, the synapses and things like that. Just looking at big blobs of the brain and seeing whether it's activated doesn't really tell us very much, at least in my view, and I think a lot of neuroscientists would agree. Another problem is some scanning methods are destructive of the tissue, so X-rays, for example. And in fact, there's often a trade-off. So if you're trying to look at something, you shine light on it often. There's one way of doing it. But light has a wavelength. And if the wavelength is bigger than the thing you're trying to look at, then you can't see a very good resolution. So you can't use light, or you can use light, but it's bigger than the things we're trying to look at. So we need to use some light that has a smaller wavelength, like X-rays. But X-rays are damaging, so there's a trade-off there. Are you willing to risk the damage, or do you go with the lower resolution? Another problem is that most of these methods require really thin sections, like millimeter thin sections of the brain, because otherwise you can't shine the light through it to get a good image, or shine the light off the surface. But the brain is a three-dimensional object, so we have to be able to combine those tiny sections into a three-dimensional image, and that's not easy to do. Also, we have many of these methods that can work on like small bits of tissue or single neurons or something like that, but to get 100 billion neurons, we need a way of automating this so that we can do it very rapidly and at a very high volume, sort of like has been done with the Human Genome Project. And the speed of imaging is important as well, so if the image takes ages to be produced, then again, that's not feasible. This slide is not that helpful for us. Oh, I guess I'll just make the broad point here. This is another one of those tables about different levels of resolution. Different imaging techniques will be will be applicable for different resolutions. So this is fairly coarse resolution, this is fine resolution. And it's probably a mixture of these technologies that's going to be useful for us. And there's another example of that, and that, just move past that. Okay, so I'll just give you a little bit of a feel for some of the imaging technologies. I'm not going to describe how they work, but I guess the argument is basically that we have these technologies to image the brain. So the question I asked was, do we have imaging technologies by which we can image the brain in sufficient detail? And essentially what I'm saying is we do, although there are qualifications to that. So one is structural MRI. Don't get confused between that and functional MRI, because they're actually quite different. This is the one I talked about before, the one I said is not very useful. This structural MRI is potentially, because it does something very different. You see, this shows us the structures of the brain. So here's the cortex here, and the brain stem and so on. That's actually quite useful potentially, whereas this just shows us blotches of activity which aren't necessarily that useful. Another one is diffusion tensor imaging, which is kind of cool. It shows us all of the fiber tracks in the brain. Like, these are basically like lots of axons connected together, which are connecting different regions of the brain, and that can be really useful for telling us how different regions of the brains are connected and how they communicate with each other. Fluorescence microscopy, this produces really pretty pictures if nothing else. This is basically where we apply chemicals that fluoresce, so they give off light, and they can reveal various structures. So these are, I think, axons or dendrites, or it's hard to tell which, and the cell body in the middle there. So that's particularly useful for visualizing subcellular structures. Then there's electron microscopy, where you shine electrons on the cells, and that can give you really good resolution. So you can see we're getting a lot of detail here. These are individual neurons and the axons. Compare that to the MRI image here, which is a much coarser level. Again, I'm arguing that we need a combination of these technologies to get all the detail that we need. And there are some really interesting, so if you remember I said before that the real trick is not the resolution, because we can kind of get that. This resolution is pretty good, and there's better than this as well. The trick is, doing that for 100 billion, times 100 billion. That's the trick, and then putting it all together in a three-dimensional piece. We have some technologies that are beginning to be used that can kind of do that. So this device here, automatic tape collecting lathe ultramicrotome, bit of a mouthful. Basically, it's a technology that has been developed only in the last few years that allows for automatic sectioning. So cutting up into, remember I said it has to be in really thin slices for these to work? This automatically cuts up a volume of tissue into small slices and scans it automatically. I can't remember what imaging technique it uses. Anyway, that's not terribly important. Here's a different one, knife edge scanning microscope, where this is kind of really cool. Here's a knife that's cutting the tissue. Here's a microscope that's scanning it at the same time as it's being cut. So that's a way of dramatically increasing the rate at which you can scan this, the material here. And there are a variety of others as well that are talked about in the paper. So I guess what I'm arguing here is we're already starting to see the emergence of these kind of technologies that allow higher volume scanning of neural tissues. And the rate of progress is quite substantial. If you look at the history of neuroimaging, it's really a very young field, and already we've seen a lot of progress. And just recently, I don't know if anyone's heard of this, Clarity. Basically, a scientist found a way of I think it was dissolving the fat tissues or something like that. But basically by doing this, he was able to make the brain transparent, which is really good because then we can see the neurons in it and things like that without having to cut it open. So this image here, I'm not sure what animal that is. It's not a human brain. And you know, this is a very new technology, so I don't exactly know how it's going to be applied. But I guess the point I wanted to make is we're seeing breakthroughs here all the time, and there's fascinating things that can potentially be done. So this quote here is from the paper that I mentioned, that I'm sort of plagiarizing this entire talk from, a lot of it. If the required level of simulation is at level 5, so you remember, that's the level I said, it's sort of in the middle of where most neuroscientists think we need. We've already got the resolution, we can already do the scanning. The trick is scaling up the technology and being able to do it fast enough, which is what I mentioned before. But given the level of the rate of progress in the field, I think it's very plausible to think that we're going to start to see the ability to do that. And later on I'll discuss some particular projects that are actually working on this right now. So, once we've got the data, we've done all that scanning, we've imaged everything, now we need to put that all together, we need to interpret it. I don't have as much to say about this because it's largely a problem of, well, as I said, it's not really specific to neuroscience. So I don't know if these terms are familiar of computational genomics, bioinformatics, proteomics, computational chemistry. All of these disciplines deal with processing massive volumes of data and trying to make sense of it, and there's many others as well, of course. They use things like imaging software and machine learning algorithms and things like that. At least from the report that, the paper that I based this talk on, it seems that that's not really going to be the barrier. We already have a lot of tools to do this. I mean, it's not going to be a trivial task to put all this data together. Remember, one example of what I mean by this is you've got to take all those thin sections of tissue and combine them into an image that's three-dimensional, so we know how the brain is structured in 3 dimensions. And that's not a trivial task, but as I was saying, that's not really going to be the roadblock that's going to hold this technology up, because we already have, relatively speaking, more ability to do that. This is just a little diagram showing how one of the programs that I'll mention later is trying to deal with these problems. So those problems are potentially solvable, I think. Now here's where I think it gets particularly interesting. Computing the model. This is what I think is going to be the sort of the key barrier. What's the roadblock keeping the technology from being developed? Because we can have all the data and we can have the model ready to go, but we have to be able to simulate it. We have to be able to run the program. Probably most of you are familiar with trying to run a program on a computer that can't really handle it, and it runs really slowly, maybe it crashes, doesn't necessarily do what you want. When you're talking about a brain on a supercomputer, that potentially is even worse. So we need to be actually able to run the simulation in a decent amount of time, more than 1 month per second of brain activity, in order for it to do what we want. That is, in order for us to see how the simulation works. Ideally, we'd like to run it in real time, which means 1 second of simulated brain activity to 1 second in real world time. And that requires a lot of computing power. So, enter this man, Gordon Moore, who was the co-founder of Intel. Now, another show of hands. Who has heard of Moore's Law? About the same as before. I would think that most people here would have heard of it because it's sort of like pretty core for futurism sort of things. Anyway, this is what he originally said, that his original statement is a little bit interesting. He originally said the minimum cost level, the transistor density at which production can proceed at the minimum cost doubles every year. But that's really hard to understand. So here's how we normally say it today. The number of transistors on an integrated circuit doubles every, it's sometimes said 2 months, it's sometimes said 2 years and sometimes 18 months. There's slightly different versions of it. Performance doubles every 18 months. So originally it was every year, and then it was sort of every 2 years, and then it was sort of every 18 months. Anyway, the exact details aren't important. I just included this to sort of cover my bases, because the original formulation is slightly different to how we say it today. Anyway, that's a bit of an aside. The basic point is computers get faster and faster all the time, which is sort of what everyone knows anyway. But it's not just that. They get faster in a very predictable way. So this is real data for the last 40 years of computer development, microprocessor transistor counts. For those who may not know, a transistor is basically like a small electronic switch, and computers work by having massive numbers of transistors, which are constantly flipping on and off doing processing, basically. The very first integrated processor that Intel released in 1971 had a couple of thousand transistors. These days, a desktop or a laptop computer that you buy, like this one, for example, would have a couple of billion transistors in it. And the whole point of Moore's law is that the rate at which the number of transistors grows is fairly consistent, even over fairly long periods of time. It's quite predictable. Moore originally proposed this law, as you can see in a paper in 1965, which was when integrated circuits, that's putting lots of transistors on a single piece of silicon, as opposed to before, where they just had them all separate. 1965 was when these integrated circuits were first being introduced, first being developed. And that law is basically held, with slight modifications, ever since then. And there are sort of other variations of Moore's law as well. This is sort of in inverted commas because they're not strictly Moore's law. So, for example, the Human Genome Project, sequencing all of the bases in the human genome, the cost fell, well, precipitously after the program had been going for a few years, and so we can now sequence a genome for a ridiculously lower price than we could originally. You can also see similar exponential changes in the energy efficiency of photovoltaic cells, and even for quantum computers, which is kind of cool. Now, a lot of people, and so you can probably see where I'm going with this. I'm going to say that we can't simulate, even if we had all the data, we can't simulate a brain now, but we will be able to at some point in the future because Moore's law will get there for us. That's the basic argument. A lot of people are uncomfortable with this argument. Well, maybe not so much futurists, but a lot of other people are uncomfortable with it, like Steven Pinker, for example, was mentioned earlier. Because they see Moore's law as a bit of a strange thing, like, well, what exactly is making this happen anyway? Like, it's not a law of nature, it's not like Newton's laws, it's just a thing that we've observed to occur historically. And obviously that's true, I'm not claiming it's a law of nature, but I still think there's a very good reason to suppose that it's going to continue for some time, and this is so I'll explain why I think that's the case. First of all is because, the law was invented by basically one of the leaders of Intel, and Intel still takes this seriously now. They have and still do formulate their design and production plans based on Moore's law. They use it as a target to set for themselves. Not just Intel, but other firms as well, but they're particularly important in developing processes. So you can see here, this is from a presentation. They're very consciously showing the progression over time. And they produce things like these, technology roadmaps. These numbers here refer to the size of transistors, basically. You see that they get smaller. They have to get smaller if you want to fit more of them onto the chip. That's how we fit more of them on, we make them smaller. Transistor size has been progressively decreasing ever since the first integrated processors were produced, and Intel maps that out and plans new releases. Like, for example, this new one here. Current computers you buy might have 32 nanometer or 22 nanometer transistors in them. Most people probably don't care about that, they just care how fast it runs, but having small transistors helps you to run fast because you get more transistors on your processor. There's a new line of transistors being released. It's been delayed a bit, but it's going to be released at the end of this year. 14 nanometer size, which is, the next generation, and so it keeps going on. Intel has this tick-tock model, whereby they alternate between decreasing the size of transistors one round of development, and then the next round of development they introduce what's called a new microarchitecture, which probably sounds complicated, but that's just a slightly different way of designing the chip. And generally they improve the microarchitecture so it gets faster. So tick, smaller transistors, tock, better microarchitecture, tick, smaller transistors, tock, better microarchitecture. Now why am I going through all of this detail? Oh, and yeah, more transistor size getting smaller and projecting out to the future again. Why am I going through all this detail? It's because I'm just trying to demystify Moore's law. It's not this magical thing. Intel plans this for years, even decades in advance, and not just Intel, other corporations too. There's very specific reasons why transistor technology develops at this rate. And more transistors aren't just magical either. So Steven Pinker, if you remember his quote from whoever mentioned that, said that processing power isn't a magical pixie dust or something like that. Obviously that's true. I don't know of anyone who argues that it is. But more transistors do very specific things. Now, don't worry if you don't really know what these things are, it's not really important, it's just an illustration of the type of things we do with more transistors. Putting more transistors, more of these little switches onto chips, doesn't magically make them faster, but it allows us to do these things. So increase the clock speeds, pipeline, branch prediction, integrate graphics cards, have more cache on the chips. And again, don't worry if you don't understand what all that is, but there are specific technological improvements that have been made because we can get more transistors on the chips. Here's a recent microarchitecture, that's the design of the chip that Intel has released. You see now they're putting multiple cores on the processor. This is maybe something you're familiar with. That means that each of these things is essentially a separate processor. Originally you only had one, now they're having 4. And in fact there's other technologies which allow each of these to sort of act as 2 as well, and so it's sort of 8 in a sense. Okay, so What I've been describing is why Moore's law is sort of held. It's held because it's sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy that has a lot of research behind it, and there's a lot of money interested in keeping it going. But also, there's another reason we should suspect Moore's law to hold. It's because it's held for not just since Moore, remember 1965 is when he originally postulated it, but we can extrapolate, well not extrapolate, we can look back at computing technology before Moore and see how it has developed. And this is a graph from Kurzweil's book, essentially showing that you can demonstrate that something like Moore's law has held for a lot longer than integrated processors. So here is when Moore made his prediction, roughly this area here. We can see Moore's law extrapolates back a lot further than that. And you might be a bit reluctant to believe Kurzweil because, you know, he's a bit of, well, he's Kurzweil. But it's not just him. It's not just like there's one guy who says that you can do this. There's a number of papers on this, like serious academic papers. Here's one, McCallum, 2003. He goes back to 1940. You can see a fairly consistent trend. By the way, this isn't a logarithmic graph, which means that this is not like 5 times as much. This is 5 orders of magnitude, or 6 or whatever it is. So that means like each of these gaps here is 10 times as many, I think. I can't actually see the numbers, but anyway, something like that. It's exponential. It's actually 2 orders of magnitude, even more than I thought. Anyway, here's another one. So this is a different researcher again, who goes back even further. Now his graph doesn't quite line up with Kurzweil's. You see he has a flat progress up until around 1940, and then he has the trend going up there. Kurzweil, you'll notice, has the sort of trend extrapolated back a bit further. But that's not really that essential. The basic point is, at least since 1940, we can see, oh, and here's another example. This is actually, what is this? Oh, computations. This is the amount of energy used per computation. This goes all the way back to ENIAC, which was the first electronic computer. So we're talking about 70 years now, of which this basic rate of progress is held. And it's all the more impressive because, as Kurzweil notes here, this is the current paradigm of integrated circuits. This is what Moore was really talking about. He's talking about packing more transistors onto this thing. But the law extrapolates back further than that. It translates back into the days where we just use separate transistors, and even further than that into relays and vacuum tubes, which are the old technologies which are obsolete now. But even when those were used, similar rates of progress in terms of operations per dollar or something like that can be observed. Now, there are foreseen problems where there are limitations to Moore's law, and there are plenty of people who think that it's going to end soon. Certainly there's an issue of, as the transistors get really small, you start to get quantum tunneling between the transistors, like electrons are leaking between them, which is bad because you lose data basically. Photolithography is the process illustrated here of how they actually make the transistors so small. They basically just shine light on things and have a mask which creates the image that's needed. There's limits to how tight the resolution can get in that, and other problems as well. So certainly there are difficulties on the horizon, but the thing is there have always been difficulties on the horizon with this. This is an interesting article. I don't have it here, but if you're interested, take a look, of some sort of predictions in the past of when Moore's law is going to end. And basically people have been predicting Moore's law is going to end ever since Moore's law was first mentioned by Moore. The people at Intel don't really agree with these pessimistic predictions. Here he's talking, one of the executives is talking about Moore's law holding through the end of the 2020s. At the very least, we've got a decade plus in even the current paradigm of computing technology. But even when that breaks down, the photolithography, integrated circuit stuff that I've been talking about, there are other possibilities as well. Some people might have heard of quantum computing, optical computing, DNA computing. Again, we're not going to get into the details of what any of that is. These are just potential future computing technologies that are very different from what we use today. And I don't know which of these will pan out. I'm sure not all of them will. Maybe it'll be something completely different to this. But remember, we've already switched paradigms a number of times. 70 years ago with ENIAC, we used vacuum tubes, which is completely different to what we use today. And still the rate of progress has continued. So as the paper sort of points out, there seems to have been a lot of undue pessimism about these sorts of changes. We seem to have been able to deal with them in the past. And there are big vested interest in keeping this growth continuing. Massive corporate profits at stake. So there's certainly a lot of interest in having this happen. Okay, so here's the... Now we come to the guts of it. This is pretty much like, if you're to take away one thing from the talk, it's this diagram here. Now, so let me just explain it a little bit. What we have here in these horizontal lines are different levels of detail. Remember that's the big table I showed before with all the levels of detail from the really high resolution, sorry, from the really abstract to the really detailed, all the individual molecules. Well, here it's the reverse. So these are the most abstract and these are the most specific up here. Because the most specific ones are the hardest to compute. They take more processing power because you've got to simulate all of the atoms, which is pretty ridiculous. So that requires a crazy amount of computing power. This line here shows the rate of growth in the speed of supercomputers. This is the particular extrapolation that's used in the paper. They show some other ones as well, and the basic story doesn't change very much if you use slightly different trend lines. So here is where we are today, this line here, this vertical line. That's how much processing power we have. And as you can see, it's just at the level of how much you would need to simulate the whole brain at the very most abstract levels, which is probably not enough detail. So that's why we don't have artificial intelligence today, because it's not enough detail. Now, remember level 5, that's the one I keep talking about as being the one that is of most interest. That's here, electrophysiology. So we sort of simplistically read off where the curves intersect. When will we have enough computing power to simulate the brain at the level of detail we think is necessary in order to produce the cognitive processes and stuff that we're interested in? And the answer is sometime in the 2030s. Now, I don't want to come across as saying that this is going to happen in the year 2034, as I've got there, which is in 20 years' time, obviously. That's not really the point. The point is that it doesn't matter if it turns out to be a higher level than we'd expected and it turns out to be harder, or even if the rate of growth slows a bit. Those things will just push this out. The curves will intersect later and it will take longer. But basically, following this sort of paradigm, it's going to happen sooner or later, short of a global extinction event or something, or if Searle turns out to be right and you can't actually do this in principle. Short of anything like that, this is basically going to happen sooner or later, is the argument I'm making. And sort of my best guess would be sometime in the 2030s. If you want to be a bit more pessimistic about supercomputer growth and how much detail we need to go into, then maybe it's a few decades later than that. But the fundamental argument doesn't really change. This is this is Kurzweil's version, basically the same thing. Yeah, he also has a similar date, basically, for when we be able to simulate a human brain. That diagram is a little bit different, but not very much about that. Okay, so just to finish off, nearly done. This isn't science fiction. So first of all, I've extrapolated, I think, in a fairly reasonable way from current scanning technologies and current developments in computing. But also, people are actually working on this stuff now. Like, it's not like I think that someday they will. So there's the Blue Brain project, which is now called the Human Brain Project. They're actually trying to simulate. First, they're trying to do bits of the human brain, and then they're going to do a mouse's brain. Ultimately, they're planning on simulating a whole human brain. So basically doing what I'm saying. And the guy who runs this thinks that they're going to be able to do this in sometime in the 2020s, perhaps. So maybe that's a bit earlier than what I've been saying. I think he is optimistic about a slightly higher level of abstraction, which is why he's saying that it's going to be a bit earlier. If he's right, then it will happen sooner. There are other projects as well. There's the Human Connectome project. This is an American project to map not exactly all of the neuron connections, but some of the sort of important connection tracks between regions of the brain. That's currently happening now. Oops. There's the new thing that's been announced by Obama, the Brain Initiative. People may have heard of this. There's not a lot of detail about this right now because they haven't sort of finalized exactly what they're doing, but it sounds like it's going to be things that are very relevant to this. So, Connectome, which is mapping all the connections of neurons in the brain and things like that, which will be very relevant. IBM's doing research into this as well in their Cognitive Computing Initiative, which is a bit more focusing on sort of the higher level, not so much on the neurons, sort of really, really detailed stuff, but a lot of it is relevant. OpenWorm is another interesting example where people are trying to simulate all of the cells in a nematode, which is related to, obviously it's not a human brain, but it's a similar process. And finally, just a little bit on computational neuroscience. So this talk was entitled Whole Brain Emulation and Computational Neuroscience. The reason I sort of put that in there is because most researchers don't say they're working on whole brain emulation because it sounds kind of weird and futuristic. They'll call themselves something like computational neuroscientists. This is the actual scientific field. This is what it's called. And let's see, do I have this here? Yeah, so I've had many a conversation when someone asks me what I want to do after university, what are you studying for? What's the point of it? And I say, computational neuroscience. And they think I'm just making things up, or like they have no idea what I'm talking about. It's not made up, it's a real thing. So, computational neuroscience is the area that studies information processing in the neural system. It's highly interdisciplinary. As you can see from the different levels I talked about, it requires elements of computer science, electrical engineering, physics, maths, chemistry, biology, and it studies all those levels basically, as I said 4. There are books on the subject. It's a very new field, really it only dates to like the 80s or something like that. There are journals on the subject. There is a journal called the Journal of Computational Neuroscience, and there are others that have very similar names: neural networks, neural computing, neuroinformatics. So again, I'm trying to paint the picture. This is actually an area of scientific research now. We can't simulate the entire brain now, but we are working on it. There's even a Coursera course on this, which I would strongly recommend, by the way, because I've done this, and it's pretty good. Now, probably don't need to spend too much time on the implications, and we can maybe touch on that in questions, but probably I should just mention this briefly. Should we be worried about this? So is this, are they going to take over the world and kill us or whatever? So I don't really think so, as you can probably gather, but I guess the real point is, I think this is going to happen, being a very technological determinist here. I think this is going to happen regardless of whether we like it or not. I think it's a good thing. Some people don't, but I think it's probably going to happen anyway. It's very difficult for me to imagine any realistic scenario where it's prevented from happening, aside from mass extinction or something like that. If America doesn't invest in the technology, then Europe will, or China will, or Japan will, or someone else will. And eventually, the computing power will exist that we just do this anyway. The other thing is, technology has risks and benefits, which sounds like an obvious point because it is. But the point is, this is a big technology, and so it may have big risks, but it also potentially has big benefits as well. And I just want to emphasize that I think that's important to bear in mind in the discussion. So that's some of the points I made here about the things we could do with this technology. I mean, you can sort of read this. I don't have time to go into the details here, but one thing that I just find that I'll just mention briefly is the idea that if you had a simulated mind on a computer, it doesn't necessarily have to be a fully conscious mind. It could just be enough of one to do the task you want. That's one advantage of a simulated system like this. You could tweak it so that you could change it and use it for exactly the ways you want. You could just ask it, read every journal article on X topic that's ever been published and write me a synthesis of it. You can't possibly do that for any computer program now because computer programs don't understand what they're reading. But if this was a human mind or something very similar to a human mind, it could do that. It could just read all the journal articles. It presumably doesn't get tired, or you could engineer that out or whatever. And you could maybe run the simulation at 10 or 100 times as fast as a human's able to do it, so you could dramatically reduce the amount of time. And it writes you up a summary. This is everything that's ever been said about X topic in 2,000 words or whatever. And that, I think, would be immensely useful in being able to actually determine the state of knowledge about a given field, rather than people reading bits and pieces. Anyway, that's just one little area, a potential application that I think of. You might think that particular example is silly, but there's myriad potential applications of this sort of technology. So, that's basically it for the talk. As you can see, the potential downside is if someone wants to unplug us once we're all uploaded by 2050, then that could be a bit of a problem, but hopefully that won't happen. So, I think we're nearly out of time, but are there any questions? Yes?
Yes, I'm reasonably well persuaded about Moore's law with respect to hardware, all things hardware, but there is no Moore's law for software. So could you explain how that half of the problem will get solved?
Yeah, so I guess this is, if I can skip back a few slides, this question about software is, oh, this is ridiculously slow. This is basically, I would say, about number 2 here. If I can ever find it. Interpreting the data. This is where the software side comes in. You have to be able to take that data and build something meaningful out of it. And this is what, I didn't say as much about this. Basically because I don't see it as being the main barrier. Really, all you need to be able to do is simulate the brain at whatever level of detail you think is necessary. We can already simulate molecules, we can simulate cells. The software exists to do all that. What doesn't exist is a sufficient volume of scanning data so that we get all the parameters right, so that we set up the simulation properly. And also we don't have enough computing power to do a big enough simulation for interesting stuff to happen. But at least from my perspective, and of course I'm not an expert on this, so perhaps others would say differently, but from my perspective it's not really a software problem. If you're trying to design an AI from the top down, that is a software problem because we don't know how to program it. The whole point of whole brain emulation is we don't need to know how to program it. We build it from the bottom down, simulating things that we do know how to program. And all we need to know is enough detail about the scanning and enough processing power to actually put that into practice.
I'd just like to register my disagreement. I do write computer simulations, and they are computer programs. They're hard to design, they're hard to implement, they're hard to test. And we're talking about not simulating something that takes 1,000 lines of code or something like that. We're talking about simulating something which operates with 100 trillion connections at a time. So we're talking about moving up many, 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 many orders of magnitude from the kinds of programs we know how to build to something else. And I don't think that's just some straightforward Moore's Law extension of anything.
Yeah, probably. So there's two things I would say to that. One is that people are working on these problems, so that's exactly what Henry Markram is concerned about trying to do with the Human Brain Project and other programs like that. So people who know a lot more about this than I do are working on that. The other thing is that there's plenty of room for disagreement here. I mean, there's people who disagree with essentially every step of my process. There are people here who think, like John Searle, who think that this is impossible in principle. There are people who think that Moore's Law will break down. There are people who think that you couldn't get the scanning to work. There are people who think that the software would be an issue. So there's plenty of room for disagreement, and I certainly don't claim to have settled all possible objections or covered every possible basis. One thing I would recommend is just looking at the paper that I cited before. I might pull that up again because it goes into some more detail about this than I do. Any other questions? Someone wants to jot the name of this down, sorry.
There's a whole brain emulation sort of done by the Future of Humanity Institute. Anders Sandberg and...
Yes, back.
Okay, let's say we've emulated the entire brain. Being an emulation rather than a simulation, we have no idea how it's working at that point. I mean, we can study it, maybe that's part of what the point is. But being an emulation, for example, we can't just turn off part of the consciousness because we don't know how that works.
Yeah.
We also can't plug in vision or hearing or anything or get an output speaking sort of thing because we don't know how to connect to any of those things through the brain. So you can't just plug in a USB stick.
So I didn't address any of those issues.
Yeah.
Right. They are addressed in the paper. Basically, the reason I didn't address them is because, at least according to the paper, and it seems consistent with what I know, those are not the main barriers. So, in other words, dealing with the processes of input and output is necessary. Like, you would have to have a way of putting the visual input in and of extracting whatever type of output we're going to get. But relative to the problem of simulating the actual information processing inside the brain, it's relatively small. Again, I'm not going to present an argument for that. I would suggest looking at the paper. But yes, you would certainly have to do that. And one other thing you mentioned, you know, if you don't understand how it works, you can't just turn off part of the consciousness. And I sort of glibly referred to that before, and that's perfectly true. So if we don't understand how this is working, we couldn't just easily manipulate it. Part of the idea is precisely that once we simulate this, you would be able to study it in ways that you never could if you didn't have this available. And so the idea is that hopefully we'll be able to dramatically increase our rate of knowledge acquisition about how the brain works, and then you could start to manipulate it potentially. Yes?
I just want to briefly touch on the potential ethical issues involved in this. You're looking at an emulation rather than a simulation, so essentially you're talking about a person,
yes,
somebody who has been scanned and put into a machine. Now, let's assume that you've succeeded, and this person is now conscious within the machine, or at least this copy of the person is conscious within the machine. Now, firstly, we have the issues of how to, what we don't know about how the emulation works, causing problems for the consciousness that's in the emulation, stresses and pain and that kind of thing, because we don't understand it, therefore we can't control it. Existential pain would seem to me to be an equally large barrier to communicating with this entity, whatever it is. The realisation that it is in fact a simulation, a copy of an individual, etc. All of these issues have been discussed in science fiction and that kind of thing. But really when it comes down to what you've got is, it's a bit like the mad scientist who doesn't know how to build robots says, let's just rip a brain out of somebody and stick it in a box. That's effectively what you're doing. So to me, it seems that it's a shortcut that leads to be an end that is ethically dubious and sort of I guess, what are you trying to do?
What's the question?
What is the point of the whole brain emulation in the end? If you're trying to build something that you can then experiment on and work out how brains work, isn't that a bit like picking something at random and cutting them up?
Yep.
What is it that you're trying to do, and how are you going to get to that point without running into these ethical issues?
Well, okay, so I guess the short answer is we won't. We'll have to deal with these ethical issues. Again, I've said that I think this is a good thing. I haven't presented an argument as to why I think it's a good thing. And if I were to do that, I would have presented very different points. What I really wanted to show today was that I think this is very likely to happen, or quite likely to happen, qualify that a little bit, in several decades. So that holds regardless of whether you think there are ethical issues or not. So I guess what I'm trying to say is the ethical issues you're raising are very important, but they're precisely not the things that I wanted to discuss in this talk.
But aren't there major barriers to the potential development of this? Aren't they going to be raised very close to the point where we're about to succeed with this and have it stopped? That's, I guess, where I'm coming from.
Yeah, that's an interesting, that's really an empirical question about how likely you think that would be to happen. I tend to think not. One thing would be potentially problematic argument. I can't think of any technologies that have been delayed. You can talk about stem cell research in America, but that's only in America. And that technology is still in its infancy, so we'll sort of have to see how that pans out. Certainly it's possible that this could be delayed, but the idea that the ethical concerns will be so paramount and so insurmountable that no one will try and be able to stop it globally or something like that, I don't consider that to be very plausible. And so that's not a reason to dismiss what you're saying, that's a reason to take the ethical considerations very seriously. But again, I guess what I'm just trying to say is that to properly address your question, I have to say a lot more that I deliberately didn't talk about in the talk, because I wanted to focus on the fact that I think it is going to happen, sort of regardless of whether we want it to or not.
Okay, we've got time for one more question. I think Kabine has one over here.
I was just going to ask why you want to see it happen. No, but like you sort of touched on it, but like why would you personally like to see the simulated brain be successful?
Okay, well yeah, so I think this is would be a really good thing, and that's why I want to get into this field. Sorry, I'm just skipping to my last slide so I can briefly touch on that. This is really annoyingly slow. Where did it go? Yeah, here we go.
I'm curious.
This is just a few things I jotted down, so this is not sort of comprehensive or anything. So one big thing is I think we could use the simulation to understand how the brain works a lot better. I think that's sort of fairly obvious that would be the case. Why would we want to do that? Psychological and neurological disorders are a massive issue. Everything from schizophrenia through to depression. All of these things we really don't know how they work. Like even, take antidepressants for example. Selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, they prevent, they basically deal with the neurotransmitters between synapses. We don't really know why they do anything. We don't know why they work at a fundamental level. Like we don't actually have a detailed understanding of that. It would be really good if we had that, because then we could develop more effective treatments. So I think that this would be a massive boon for psychology and for psychiatry and related areas in understanding this substance, Alzheimer's, neurodegenerative disorders, massive problem. I think this would be good for that. I think it would also be useful for science as a whole. So if we could connect up a brain, I'll put this down here. Yeah, weather, here we go. So you take a brain, probably it would need to be sort of modified in various ways. It wouldn't be exactly the same as a human brain, but we develop the technology out of a simulated brain. We connect up its sensory inputs directly to like all of the weather stations across the entire world. So essentially what we've got is sort of a pseudo-conscious entity that has direct sensory access to weather information basically, and then is able to process that in a direct way that a human never could. That might sound a bit sort of bizarre and science fiction-y, but there's no real, I mean the human brain is very plastic. You feed in data and it will process that. Again, I haven't really talked too much about that, but basically, I think we could take this technology and use it for an immense number of different things. What I'm talking about is being able to create human-level intelligence on a computer in a sort of malleable way, in a way that doesn't take 20, 25 years potentially to train. And I think that would have massive applications for all sorts of things in science and in understanding, synthesizing data, in weather prediction. So basically, that's a really short and unsatisfactory answer to your question. I think it would be really useful.
So it's just basically this is going to be cool.
I think this will help solve problems like world poverty and climate change, because fundamentally we don't have solutions to that because we don't know the answer.
Okay.
And more smart brains working on the problem could help with that.
Okay.
What about curing that?
Yeah, that'd be a nice side effect as well.
That's the obvious application.
Yeah, but potentially, you could upload your own mind onto one of these and live forever. That's not something I went into, but that's another potential application.
So scaling up intelligence so as to be able to solve problems that our current level of intelligence can't solve. So
yeah. As well. Again, there's a lot more to say about that, so I don't want to.
Yeah. All right. Well, Kevin,
Sorry.
it's your turn. Okay. Thank you.